All right, welcome back once again to the vault. We're going to take a look today at some EC printing variations, starting with this Crime Suspense Stories #1. And at first glance, obviously, these look the same. What makes them different is the indicia on the inside front cover. So this copy is an actual first printing, and as you can see, there's a blacked out line there. This is known as the blacked out indicia version. And volume 1, number 1, printed over the blacked out line. What is under that blacked out line is volume 1, number 15, Vault of Horror. So Crime Suspense Stories was going to take over the numbering and the printing schedule for Vault of Horror. And what was happening at that time was that Tales from the Crypt was going to be the only EC horror magazine to remain in publication. So the title changed from Crypt of Terror to Tales from the Crypt. And Vault of Horror was going to be replaced by Crime Suspense Stories. Haunt of Fear was going to be replaced by Two-Fisted Tales. But then the sales receipts started coming in, and my cat is going to walk right in front of this. Come on, girl. Good girl. And where was I? Haunt of Fear was going to be replaced by Two-Fisted Tales, but the sales receipts started coming in, and they decided they would keep all 3 horror books, thankfully, in publication. And Crime Suspense Stories and Two-Fisted Tales would roll out as their own titles. So in the case of Crime Suspense Stories, it became volume 1, number 1. And as you can see there, that blacked out line is no longer there. This is the second printing. And Vault of Horror, number 15, came out on schedule. So the copyright registrations for Crime Suspense Stories #1 and Vault of Horror number 15 were actually filed on the same day in July of 1950. And so there was no disruption to the printing schedule for Vault of Horror number 15, which happens to be the only place where you can see Crime Suspense Stories with the numbering taken over from Vault of Horror, which would have been number 15. So here's an ad for Crime Suspense Stories #1 with the number 15, which appeared, strangely enough, in Vault of Horror number 15, which Crime Suspense Stories was supposed to take its place. So there you have that. Now, it bears a little discussion what else was going on at the time with the printing schedules. So Haunt of Fear started with number 15, which it took over the numbering from Gunfighter. Number 16, number 17, and number 18. That's right. Two-Fisted Tales was going to take over the numbering of Haunt of Fear, and it also took over the printing schedule. Now, what happened here was a little strange. So the copyright registration for Two-Fisted Tales number 18 was filed at the end of July. The copyright registration for the actual 4th issue of Haunt of Fear, which did continue publication, wasn't filed until October 10th. And as you can see, it's got a November-December cover date. What happened was Haunt of Fear, the 4th issue, which was replaced in the printing schedule by Two-Fisted Tales number 18, did not appear until more than 4 full months after the 3rd issue of Haunt of Fear. They never corrected that. They never corrected the dates on the cover, and as a result, Haunt of Fear had by far the shortest print life of any of the ECs. That's something that I like to set the record straight on, because Bill Gaines remembered later that Haunt of Fear with Graham Ingles covers didn't sell as well as the others. Well, the reason was sometimes it appeared within the month on the date on the cover, and it had by far the shortest shelf life of any of the other ECs. So let's move on to some other interesting print variations. Here is the 3rd issue of Weird Science, and this is the US edition. Now in Canada, ECs were reprinted by Superior Comics. So Canadian printings, the biggest difference actually also involves this first issue of Crime Suspense Stories. So in Canada, crime comics weren't allowed. They were illegal. So the word crime couldn't be used. They changed the title to Weird Suspense Stories, and they printed the first 3 issues of Crime Suspense Stories as Weird Suspense Stories. And they dropped in the weird from Weird Science over the suspense stories. They're extremely rare. I don't have one of those. So another very, very interesting print variation, though, is this one. So here we see the US printing of Weird Science, the 3rd issue. Here's the Superior Canadian printing. They've reversed the reds and greens. It's the only comic that Superior reprinted from EC where there was this drastic a color variation on the cover. So that's a cool one to have. Another really interesting variation is Impact. So on the left, we have a first printing, which was done by Charlton. And Bill Gaines was so unhappy with the quality that he ordered the print run destroyed and had them reprinted. And you can differentiate these by the white logo on the Charlton printing versus the yellow logo on the second printing. Now, these were originally thought to be very, very rare, and it turns out they're not so rare. So they're scarce compared to the yellow logo version, but both can be found fairly easily. So if you've got an Impact number 1 with a white logo, that's a first printing. Yellow logo would be the second printing. Now we'll quickly get into some print variations that occurred when the EC comics were reprinted later in life. So we've got here the last issue of Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt number 46. This, again, there was a delay between 45 and 46. 45 would have been the last issue when they discontinued the horror comics, and they had some leftover material that sat around for almost 5 months. And the reason for that was Tales from the Crypt number 46 was going to be Crypt of Terror number 1. When it was reprinted in 1973 by Bruce Hershenson and Ron Barlow as the first East Coast Comics EC Classics reprint, this is the only time that Crypt of Terror number 1 has been printed as originally intended, with this cover versus Tales from the Crypt 46, which is how it was originally published when it was the last EC horror comic published. And here we have Haunt of Fear number 22. Now, when the EC comics were printed by Gladstone Comics in the late 80s, they did some interesting variations here. So Vault of Horror was printed as a double issue, and it says there are 2 horror comics in one. So it was Vault of Horror and Haunt of Fear. They used the cover for Haunt of Fear number 22, which was reprinted in the back of this issue of Vault of Horror. So this is the only time that ghastly Graham Ingalls art was used on a Vault of Horror comic. There were a couple other weird variations from Gladstone that were kind of the same thing. This is definitely an example of Crime Suspense Stories number 16. There's the original comic. It was reprinted, double-sized horror. So Crime Suspense Stories 16 was in the back of an issue of Tales from the Crypt. So there you've got the Crime Suspense Stories 16 cover with a Tales from the Crypt logo dropped in, and the Ghoul Lunatics kind of awkwardly patched in where that Jolting Tales of Tension box was on the original cover. And then lastly, another Gladstone variation. They've got Weird Science Fantasy number 27. They used the art for their 4th issue of Weird Science, so you can see that they took the Weird from Weird Science Fantasy's logo, dropped in the Science from Weird Science, creating another little EC variation. So there you have it. As I find more things in my Vault of Horror here, I will continue posting videos, and we will see you next time.